Thank you so much, Rohail, and greetings from Toronto, Canada, where it's, I believe we're something like 23 degrees colder than where you are in Delhi right now. So it's a little chilly here, but pleasure to be with you. We certainly have, many ties between Canada and India. We have 1.4 million Indo-Canadians. And, we've got lots of educational exchanges and things like that. So I think it's, this is a really opportune forum for us to learn from each other. So it's a great pleasure to be with you. In terms of the, just where we're coming from, so News Media Canada, we represent about 570 titles across Canada. And just to give you a sort of a sense of the breadth of the membership, I would say roughly a third are, very large publications, whether an individual title or large chains. We've got another third, which are, I would say, sort of mid-sized chains and larger independents. And then we've got another third, which are really truly independents, very small. They may have a few employees. Some of them are literally, some sort of mom and pop type enterprises that are producing, a newspaper that serves a community of 1,200 or something like that. So we go from the very large to the very small. I guess just, philosophically, we all obviously believe that a strong independent press is vital to our democracy. And if you look at sort of the world that we're living in today, the need for trusted journalism has never been higher. We live in a world where, lots of fake news, politicians saying that everything is fake. We have this sort of citizen publishing, which is good and healthy, but in a world where everyone is a publisher, there needs to be an understanding that with being a publisher comes a level of responsibility, and that responsibility is first and foremost to. Sorry, I'm getting background or no. First and foremost, that we have a responsibility to our readers and that our reporting is honest, that it's accurate, that it's fair, and that it's balanced. And to produce that, real journalism costs real money. And to create that quality content, we must be commercially viable. As all of you are too well aware, the business model has been disrupted. To give you a sense in Canada on sort of revenue decline, that for newspapers, revenue probably peaked a decade or so ago at about $5 billion. Today, it's roughly $1 billion. And in that same time, the revenues for Google and Meta in Canada would have gone from, let's say, $1 billion or so 10 years ago to roughly $10 billion today. So there's really been this inverse between sort of the revenue of publishers and the platforms. And we've obviously, as you've seen in India as well, but the revenue has not rebounded from the pre-pandemic levels. So that's been a real problem, especially for a lot of our print titles. And as we look at this, I think competition authorities around the world are coming to terms with the dominance of Google and Meta in the ad market, but not enough has been done to address it. So I think, in Canada and around the world, essentially what we have is a market failure, which is having a really devastating impact on content and on local news. In Canada, we've seen hundreds of news outlets have been shuttered over the past decade. We've had thousands of journalists, not just in print media, but in radio and television, have been let go. So it's really a very difficult market for news. But at the same time, the content that our journalists produce has great value to our readers and to the web giants. So despite the challenging circumstances, I think everyone's really done a terrific job in terms of producing high quality news. Now, obviously for that news, our belief is that we should be compensated by the platforms. And, there is a significant imbalance of power between the tech giants and the Canadian news outlets. And news outlets around the world. So we wanted the government to act, and the government itself has wanted to act, and I think has been noodling this for at least 5 years or so, trying to figure out the best way to do this. So the question is, how do you do it? So as Taylor mentioned, one of the ways is simply to tax it and putting the money in a fund. We have concerns with that in terms of the level of government intervention, where you essentially are getting into, more of a situation where you've got the government picking winners and losers. So we don't see that as a viable option. The second would be to go the copyright route, which is long and complex. And to be honest, if that were to take, I don't know, 5 or 10 years to deal with, we're not going to have enough publishers around if we wait that long. And then the third way is essentially to, try to address it through competition policy. And that's essentially where we've landed. So in the summer of 2021, the governing party, which is the Liberal Party, in their election platform, they proposed that we follow the Australian News Media Bargaining Code, which was still in its infancy at that point. Most of the other parties in Parliament were in broad agreement on it. One of the parties was looking, I think, more in terms of going the copyright route, but generally, I think there was reasonable consensus that this was a good approach. So we were very pleased earlier this year. Pablo Rodriguez, who's the Minister of Canadian Heritage, introduced C18, the Online News Act, in the House of Commons. And this legislation leads for a number of reasons. First of all, the need for strong independent local press has never been greater. It keeps us connected, whether it's covering city hall, provincial governments, territorial governments, our national government. It's very important that we hold these institutions accountable. And we actually surveyed Canadians a number of months ago, and we asked one of our research firms, and this is a poll that we've paid for and sponsored, what they think about the importance of local media. And there was high agreement. Something like 90% of Canadians said that it's important that our local media outlets survive. And about 80% thought that some form of legislation was needed to address this. The power imbalance between the platforms and the publishers is huge. And just to give you a sense of it, the combined market cap of Google and Meta, and I know it's been going down in particular on the Meta side, but it's about 3/4 of Canada's annual GDP. So that's just like these are massive companies. With the prospect of our parliamentarians acting, as Taylor mentioned, Google and Meta started doing content licensing agreements with publishers, and effectively what's happened is they're picking winners and losers. They picked about a dozen publishers or so, and that's created a real problem, because we've got sort of a situation now essentially of haves and have-nots among our publishers. And that's very troubling. It's not fair. And we're at a point now where we've got a lot of publishers that are left out in the cold, and that's obviously not healthy for the media ecosystem overall. What the legislation does is it allows us, as Taylor mentioned, to negotiate collectively. And currently, our competition laws would bar us from forming a collective. But given the overwhelming power imbalance, we feel that we'll be in a stronger bargaining position if we stand together. It also includes an enforcement mechanism, final offer arbitration, ensuring that all parties put their best offer forward, and then the arbitrator picks one or the other. And it's that hammer of arbitration that really incents both sides to reach a fair settlement on their own. As you know, in Australia, nothing has actually gone to arbitration. I don't know if anything actually ever will in Canada once this legislation is passed, but it basically forces both parties to get to the table and to be serious. I know you heard from Rod Sims recently, and if you look at sort of the benefit that the news media bargaining code has accrued to the news businesses, it's something in the neighborhood of $200 million. And it's not, some of these platforms will tell you, all the money went to Rupert Murdoch, that, basically there's no money for smaller entities. But if you look at groups like Country Press Australia, and I know you heard from Paul Thomas, and he led that negotiation, they seem very happy with what they were able to achieve. And then more recently, we had a group of 24 smaller Australian publishers that came together. And it's interesting, it was actually a private charitable foundation that negotiated on their behalf, and they were able to conclude agreements. As Taylor mentioned, our legislation is, it builds on the success of the Australian News Media Bargaining Code, but it's also different. So I'll highlight just a few that certainly caught our attention. One is that in Australia, in terms of who makes the determination of which platforms are subject to the Act, that's made by the minister. In Canada, that's made by the CRTC, which is this broadcast regulator that Taylor referred to. So that sort of takes the decision away from the politicians and puts it to an arm's length regulator. So we think that is certainly a welcome development. The entitlement to remuneration is also much more clear in our legislation. It refers to fair compensation for the news content that is made in Australia. Made available. And in Australia, the statute is actually not as explicit on that. It's also interesting. It says that an appropriate portion of the remuneration must be used by the news business to create news content, and there's no such provision in the Australian legislation. And again, we think that's a positive development. And we also have an explicit exemption from the Competition Act in our legislation. The Australian legislation is silent on that point, but again, we think that that's important. It also gives the CRTC, this broadcast regulator, powers to publish non-confidential information, to produce an annual report about the deals, to basically show sort of what has happened in aggregate. And again, we think that that's actually a constructive development. There's lots of demands for transparency. I would say there's not full public transparency on commercial deals, but there's a level of transparency which we think is appropriate and balanced. Now, when it comes to, once the legislation passes, and we're hoping that the legislation will pass this spring, it should. We have a bicameral system in Canada, and it should finish up with the House of Commons Heritage Committee, either actually potentially today or next week. And then from there, it will go to the full House and then to the Senate, where we'll expect, sort of further amendments. But the question really becomes, once this legislation is passed, how do you sort of make sure that everyone benefits equally from the settlement? And so we have come together with another organization, the National Ethnic Press and Media Council, and we've devised what we think is a very simple formula, which is and one of the reasons that we came to this is the smaller publishers, who don't have any sort of corporate overhead, were concerned that effectively they would be subsidizing the larger publishers that have, a law department, an HR department, and all of the sort of corporate overhead that is unrelated to the production of journalism. So we've come up with a formula which we think works and satisfies the need of everybody and is fair to everyone. And it's simply this: that we basically each publisher will submit to a law firm or an accounting firm on sort of a black box basis their investment in newsroom salary and wages. We'll take that. Whatever we can negotiate from Google and Meta, will then basically divide that up on a pro rata basis. So we're rewarding investment in newsroom, and we think that's really the fair way to go. from our perspective, this is very good legislation, and but it can also be made better. And there's this process that I refer to in terms of the Heritage Committee in the House of Commons. They're going through that right now. We've proposed a number of amendments to the bill, and I'll just walk you through them very quickly. The legislation right now really only applies to those publishers that have 2 or more arm's length employees. And again, as I mentioned, I don't have the exact number, but let's say 100 of our members are essentially, very small sort of mom and pop shops. So we want the owner operator, who is a journalist, to count towards that minimum. So that, as Taylor mentioned, that's been approved or amended by the committee. We'll see, it's still got a ways to go through Parliament. We'll see where it lands, but we think that's a very important improvement on the legislation. The second thing is we've got, there's essentially 2 qualifications to be eligible. One is something called a qualified Canadian journalism organization, which involves a number of criteria. You've got to have more than 2 arm's length employees. You got to adhere to editorial standards, etc. On the other criteria, which just said you have to have 2 employees, there was no reference to editorial standards. So we've suggested language. Other parties have as well. Google has made this point. So the committee has now come up with language that has, a level of sort of editorial standards, which we think is important. Finally, we want some sort of shot clock mechanism in the legislation. So right now it basically says something like, this process will be done in a reasonable period of time, but what's reasonable to one person may not be reasonable to another. So we proposed timing around the actual negotiation, around mediation, and around arbitration, and we think that's an improvement to the bill. I should also just add, it's great to see that others are picking up on this. Obviously, Australia really sort of set the mark. Canada is following. I know you have great interest in this in India. We've seen New Zealand, and we're very close to a group of publishers throughout the Americas, and they're looking at Canada very closely and really hoping that this happens. We're also obviously all looking at the Americans in terms of the JCPA. I know that wasn't part of the defense bill, or it was sort of removed from the defense bill, but we'll see where that lands. But again, we're hopeful for our friends in the US that they can get that done in this lame duck session of Congress before the new Congress comes in. I guess just a couple of final thoughts. Content licensing agreements are obviously helpful, they're needed, they're valuable, but they're not a silver bullet. We have a number of supports in Canada. As Taylor mentioned, we've got the Canadian Journalism Labour Tax Credit, which provides a credit of 25% of newsroom salary and wages up to a certain cap. That's been very, very important to us. We also have the Local Journalism Initiative, which actually funds journalist positions in news deserts and areas of news poverty throughout the country. That's been a terrific program, especially in sort of more rural and remote areas. And we have a number of other supports as well. But fundamentally, however, publishers really have to address their business model and succeed in sort of this new digital world. One of the lessons I think of recent years for publishers in Canada and everywhere else in the world is we cannot cut our way to growth. We've seen attempts at that sort of over the past decade, and in many cases cutting expenses has been necessary, but it's not going to get us over the hump in terms of where we need to be. So in this world of declining ad dollars, we have to invest in quality journalism that people are willing to pay for on a subscription basis. Our citizens need more news and less noise. I used to be on the board of directors of the Canadian Journalism Foundation, and their tagline is, "As journalism grows, so goes democracy." And I would say that those words are really much more than a tagline. They're really a fundamental truth. And we need an informed population and a vibrant media to keep institutions in check and strengthen our democracy. So thank you very much.